Welcome to Breakout Session 2, integrating trauma-sensitive approaches and social-emotional learning with the aim of creating safe, supportive, and culturally responsive schools. We're going to go through a good amount of information in this session and take opportunities to pause as you're listening or joining this session to really think about the application of your work, obviously within your context and your school, your district. So definitely make sure that as we go through the content, that you take any time that you need to either pause the video and think through any of the reflection prompts at your leisure. When we think about this context or this construct, we really first want to talk about social and emotional learning. We're going to talk about this idea of readiness in a little bit, but right away, the first thing we really want to talk about is really foundationally unpack what SEL is. We hear it a lot. So SEL, as the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, our friends at CASEL have coined SEL as the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, or competencies, even attitudes to develop healthy identity development, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, showing empathy for others, and establishing the ability to maintain supportive relationships. Again, that's with peers, that's with adults, and make responsible and caring decisions. So how do we get all of that? That is underpinned by various practices, even activities, some of them being evidence-based, some of them being just responsive to young people as we engage them in this process of both exposing them to the knowledge base, but also crystallizing these competencies. And that's always really dependent on the development or the age that you are catching the young people that we're engaging in the process of social emotional learning. So it's an ongoing process. And from the definition, the key component is that it's not only being developed in young people and crystallizing young people, it's also being crystallized and kind of constantly being evolved within us as adults. And so again, that's super important as we think through the implications of how to become more trauma sensitive. Next slide. So let's talk about the competencies or the skills that CASEL. So what you see here in front of you are what we usually call lovingly the CASEL 5 foundational skills or competencies that young people, depending on their stage of development, need to be both exposed to in different stages, allowed for application in that process of social and emotional learning towards that mastery of these concepts. And that mastery may not happen necessarily in your time with these young people. It is something that, again, will happen and crystallize in the continuum of their development. So let's just look at this really quickly to think about what are these 5. And it's always a great opportunity here to think, what are we working on? Because this is going to come back to how we think about implementation, how we think about comprehensive student support, and also how we think about the measurement or the attribution as we implement these key competencies. So let's look at them. Self-awareness, recognizing one's own feeling, interests, strengths, and limitations. Self-management, this idea of making sure that we can regulate our emotions as we both identify them, work through them. Again, looks very different depending on the age group that you work with. An ability to engage in social awareness, right? Taking the perspectives, developing the empathy, the connections between different cultures, different peers, different developmental ecologies, to really make sure that we can get ourselves into a good space for relationship skills, where we then can exhibit pro-social behaviors across different systems of support, including peers, adults, so that we can demonstrate these positive social skills depending on different contexts, specifically as we develop them again across their trajectory of both academic, social, emotional learning. This is going to come always big. They're going to have different relationships. So we always are focusing on this. And then getting to this idea of really meta thinking, of responsible decision making, these ethical choices that they're going to be confronted with in their lives, and making sure that they know how to weigh the appropriate solutions, make the the trial and error or embrace trial and error in this way of developing skills and competencies. And again, always making sure that understanding that these work in kind of orchestra with each other and not necessarily in isolation. So it's always really important to make sure that we start here, making sure that we know what we're working towards. And this is a great time to think, what other competencies or other skill frameworks or skill sets are you trying to work with in your young people? Social emotional learning is a means to the end of developing skill and competencies. And we know from research, it's always good to look at these Castle 5. They're very, again, evidence, they're research-based. However, at the end of the day, there are various different skill sets that we know we want our young people to be both exposed to and apply in their, again, social, emotional, and academic development. Now, let's talk about a little bit here around the intersections of trauma and social emotional development. So again, lots of research out there from early childhood to now this continuum of adulthood, implementing or thinking through the science of learning development, really that has given us a lot of insights on brain development, on the idea of the more malleable, we understand now that the brain is more malleable than we have ever really understood and has a lot of opportunities to grow, to apply versus the limitations that we once thought. And so we have to think about how trauma, how these cultural traumas, these cascading traumas, individual traumas impact development. And specifically in young people, especially if depending on when this trauma is they're exposed to these traumas or adverse childhood constructs, is really to say that, again, it can impact or does impact the capacity for young people to self-regulate. It impacts our awareness of others and self. So again, very much in these SEL competencies and domains. The traumatized, again, child or someone who has experienced trauma and at times gets triggered by their traumas will have will it affect their ability to engage socially and form bonds or relationships due to either issues of trust, issues, again, of triggers, of, again, depending on the context of what's happening within those relationships, specifically with adults. When we talk about adult SEL shortly. And obviously our ability to attend or focus on information accurately to assess situations, make decisions, and not always necessarily be coming from an emotional triggering response, because again, we don't necessarily, this is a broad construct of what trauma, stress can do to young people or to humans. But the idea here is the more we can connect to what is happening, what types of traumas, what are the events within our young people will also allow us to provide better systems of support, which we're going to talk about in a second. So why are schools then addressing trauma? And again, these learning settings and understanding that SEL as a learning process is ecological, as it takes a whole developmental approach to supporting the young people. We know schools as a main place where young people then also learn and develop are critical at addressing or assessing, putting into context what is happening in our young people's lives, including stress, trauma, or any kind of just other adverse developmental things that are happening to them. And that lives specifically in what we'll talk about as key constructs around relationships. But let's just talk about why. Again, unaddressed trauma has negative impacts on learning and academic success. We've seen that in the classroom, we've seen it in the hallways. The idea here more is to try to figure out how we get young people to back on the track of learning recovery, specifically after such a collective or universal trauma that we have all been experiencing within the last year or so. Schools risk misunderstanding, mislabeling, misdiagnosing, re-traumatizing young people. This is a very big issue here. Again, we get back to the more we can, through these type of sessions, assess who and what is the right system of support for our young people, we need to make sure that we are not putting them in a place of haphazard support. There are very specific concepts, especially when you start talking about concepts of trauma or mental health, that again, a teacher, a student support staff personnel, a coach may find out And we know that there are various policies and procedures to how we engage young people in these discussions, especially around being mandated reporters. But at the end of the day, as we talk about the systems of support that exist, we need to make sure that we are both putting them in the right, connecting them to the right resources, connecting them to the right human, the right evidence-based intervention, depending on what we find out is happening related to the trauma. Schools can help to prevent and mitigate the negative effects of trauma through, again, levers like SEL, where we provide more informal, more ways of young people to process the emotions that might be being triggered by said trauma or said stress or adverse situation, and creating a safe space for young people to unpack their emotions, work through those emotions with, again, a caring adult, caring peers. We have to be very intentional about how we structure those conversations to make sure that we can engage young people and not re-traumatize through those conversations. It's a delicate walk. Again, educators' trauma negatively affects job performance and morale. Why is that important now in the context of this conversation? Is that now in this universal trauma, we are all going through something. We have all experienced a blip year, different issues that have happened during that year. And us as adults have to take the onus to make sure to say that we know that we have also been affected, and we are not just sitting here and then take care of ourselves and work through and be very conscious of how that, in the same that physics energy transfers, us having our own negative charges or stress and carrying it into classroom affects learning conditions, affects relationships. We have to be attuned to that and figure out, again, how the system supports making sure that we're both taking care of ourselves, supporting the young people, but also not necessarily harming anybody inadvertently. And addressing trauma, obviously, can positively affect students, families, staff, school. So we're talking about those ecologies that, again, the inputs that come into our setting that affect the learning in the classroom. We need to make sure that we are looking across, again, all of the different constructs that our young people are facing on a daily basis, including this universal trauma of COVID or a pandemic. But again, really then what else is happening in their lives that then is compacting, amplifying, and then how is it manifesting, obviously, within either their academics or their social emotional indicators, which could be, again, how they're acting in class, how their grades are dipping, how they're acting across there. Have you seen them in classroom at any point recently, right? It always comes back to, especially in this virtual environment, we really know and cannot discount what is happening on the other side of the screen. If we're in person, then we still get back to, it's just about making sure that we are more and more student-centered, and every student has different things happening within their family structure, their neighborhood and community structure, and how they're experiencing school. So again, always interesting, make sure that we differentiate support. And how do we do that? We have to go think about that as a systems-based approach. So we talk about trauma-sensitive schools. And there is where we get into an opportunity to really think about that this is an all-hands approach. This is a universal approach to working, especially when we throw SEL as a key lever for equity, making sure that we know that all young people are going through things differently. They're going to need different supports to get them through what they're experiencing. And that puts us in a conundrum of human resources, general resources, at times even just space. But we think about it in the application of a multi-tiered systems of support, or just a system of support that allows us to think around tier 1 interventions, which then puts us in a space of thinking about SEL as a universal intervention. All young people get tier 1 universal intervention, and if we more and more conceptualize as SEL both in the classroom, in the hallway, on the school bus, again, in that creeping into the family dynamic or the learning setting at home, the after-school programs, the camp-based settings, everyone experiencing SEL will allow consistency and support. And it allows for a bit of a kind of prevention to make sure that we know if we're engaging young people in SEL, if we're exploring what's happening in their self-awareness, in their self-management, in their relationship skills, as they're applying those responsible decisions, we as educators should have an opportunity, both either through formal assessment or informal assessment, to read what is going on and get good information around what is happening in little Fausto's life, to then figure out how he and his peers either need more secondary interventions or more focused interventions. And obviously, as we then find out what's happening in his life, how he's experienced the last 14 months, what was happening in their lives prior to COVID, or what is currently happening in the summer, or anything that they've experienced throughout. Because again, these type of contexts can come out from day to day, hour to hour. Then how do we know that they need either even more individualized support as a tier 3 intervention? So we put ourselves into it that trauma-sensitive schools are in a place of developing and implementing sound systems that make sure that young people, one, experience at a tier 1 level, universal supports, everyone, all hands on deck, and more figuring out how using data on young people, using the data both from academic, their social emotional indicators, help support why they get into tier 2, how they get into tier 3 supports, and also how they graduate out of them. Because specifically in tier 1, we want that for all students. Trauma-sensitive schools also know that, again, young people can shift. They might participate in a tier 2 group intervention, either with a counselor or a vendor, and make gains. And that gets them, let's say, to graduate out of the interventions. Trauma-sensitive schools understand, or educators in our mindsets understand that, again, young people shift in what is happening in their lives, and they can transition out of our services and get back to just, again, let's say tier 1 and universal processes. There are a lot of tools, there's a lot of evidence-based strategies, activities that support that work in the tier 1 activities, and even more focused in tier 2. And as we get into tier 3, we get again into specialization. And at times it's really making sure that we know what the systems are, that teachers, school personnel know what those tier 2 and tier 3 strategies are to help their students and connect them to those resources, because those become resources in a trauma-sensitive school. So the systems building very much, or as we walk or think about this as a framework, because this very much comes from an MTSS framework, we used to always focus on this concept of aligning services. Now we're really going to talk about this as the importance of integrating SEL and trauma sensitivity, and how the system of support really is the key lever to integration. Now, why do we need to differentiate alignment for integration? Because alignment's important. Alignment is always great because we know we have a lot of different things happening in our learning setting, in our schools, in our districts. At times, really, once we put them and align them, which means that some diagnostic happened, hopefully it was data-driven to see what are we doing, what are the strategies, evidence-based strategies, or again, just good practical strategies that we're engaging in with our students or our schools or our families. But at the end of the day, what we don't want to do as we go from alignment to integration is that if we, at times, since we know we have so many different both funding streams, interventionists, implementers, support systems, we don't want to get into a place where we are doing parallel efforts. And there's a why to that. The bullets in front of you now can put you into a place of maybe even reflection. As you look at these bullets, think about, again, maybe your experience of implementing student support strategies over the years. How many of these have you seen happen at times? So listen, so when we have parallel implementation efforts, we tend to have incomplete understanding of each approach. So it's kind of a bit too fragmented. That leads to fragment implementation. Obviously, that can also lead to fragmented measurement, because we all know what you put in, you might get put out. So the idea here is, if we don't pay attention to understanding, again, this is what SEL is and what SEL can do in this space, and this is what trauma is and what trauma can do, and we're going to get there, and what it all takes to do it so that we aren't fragmented. We really have to spend a lot of time, again, being grounded in our goals, the vision for why we are integrating SEL and trauma, and we'll talk about that and explain a tool in a second. But what we don't want is fragmentation. Now, here is a great way of, again, visually thinking about integration as we look at, again, the various components that we don't want to necessarily, we want to be very clear about so that we aren't confusing or contradictory in the message of implementation. So that, again, looking at this, we can also assess through these boxes, through this visualization, how we don't allow for priorities to compete or how we all get on the same page. Again, always with the key point of that last slide, which is avoiding fatigue. Because I think all of us who are here today could probably think back to many different times where we have gotten a new flavor of the month, a new soft concept in academics, where again, everyone's on it. But again, this is about getting this in at a systems level for the long haul, because we know through research and just broader, just practical application, if we pay attention to the SEL and the trauma sensitivity, because we know that we just want to unpack what is happening in young people's lives, not necessarily label that everything is trauma, but how do we know that without necessarily developing a shared understanding and an integrated vision for this integration? We're going to talk about what that looks like in a second. We need to build a readiness of staff to think about this and build capacity. There's an easy way of thinking about it that comes out of the research, which is R equals MC squared. Readiness equals motivation times capacity. We'll talk about that capacity squared in a second. What does that capacity look like at the system and at the individual level to implement or to integrate SEL and trauma sensitivity? It's hyper important. We have to pay attention to mindsets. This idea of really building on, let's say, Carol Dweck's growth mindset versus fixed mindset. We're really pushing ourselves to now think about traditional towards transformative mindsets. We're going to talk about what that looks like and how that challenges adults to really, again, be more mindful of their practice. And that really puts us in an adult SEL space, because us adults along the way with SEL being, again, psychosocial support is not a new thing in education. However, the coining of SEL and the why we as adults have to be prepared both to implement, model that work, and come with our own well-being at front and center, because we are attacking both trauma and very difficult conversations or topics on a daily basis as we are even adjacent to trauma or stress or adverse childhood experiences, or just general developmental angst. It is not an easy job. Us as adults, as staff members, as just as cogs in that systems of support, need to make sure that we are well tuned. Think about joint implementation. This is not a this takes a village approach, a all hands on deck approach, as was mentioned before, to implement that system, to connect the various resources that will be uncovered as we get more and more to be student centered, understanding that every student has something else happening in their lives, and push ourselves towards an equity lens, which really is explicitly that. Every young person, every human needs support. We at times are going to be challenged by not having enough just ratios alone between students and adults to provide that support. That does not mean that we should give up. So again, those joint implementations, those partnerships, pushing the equity lens that this is for all, not for some. This is for all at the quality level of the type of services that they should interact with, including external services, community services, so that we are at the pulse constantly of being, again, the herders of that work. So let's continue to talk a little bit about shared integration and vision, because that just does not happen. Take a second here to look at this very colorful way of thinking about or differentiate. We've talked about and defined a bit about what SEL is the process of attaining skills, competencies. We talked about the competencies, but take a look at what, again, when it comes to an understanding of why, especially at a school-wide systems level SEL, take a look at those bullets. You see that we're looking at a growth focus, an asset-based approach. Again, skill competency development fundamentally philosophically comes out of a constructivist approach. This idea that we know that young people inertly have assets inside that we as educators are there to both help them explore, I would say at times even exploit, because interest-based learning is always going to be something that can motivate young people, but young people and us as adults have to come with a growth mindset again, coining Carol Dweck's research. We'll talk about mindsets now, even in relation to that, but the idea is if the adult constantly feels that the young person cannot do that, then they are not necessarily looking and understanding not only what SEL is, but how and why SEL is important. Again, young people need to be empowered and develop that efficacy for themselves. Again, they need to build out, depending on, as we engage young people in SEL, we see that, again, depending on what is happening across all of their different little desks and or their virtual spaces, they are all experiencing something in their lives that then will need some type of support. And that can either be some level of resilience building, if they're in a trauma space, just some general mental health support or promotion, depending on what they're dealing with in their life. We're all dealing with something. We need to create the spaces to unpack that more and more with young people so they feel safe enough to tell someone before it becomes such a big deal. And like that, we see that with depression, we see that and more, even with younger students, we see that manifesting itself with self-harm, ideation. And if young people do not have a adult who can both model and create those safe spaces to even just get some small indicator of what's happening there to then graduate it to some higher level intervention or support, that blue is not happening, is not aligned even before we start to then integrate the concepts. And obviously more and more in this SEL as a tier 1 intervention is that it should be embedded across all instruction and the learning environment. So it isn't a 15-minute stop, it is the whole learning construct. So SEL as a learning process involves academics. Again, so grouping strategies, in the times for reflection, and different ways and different modalities to put it in play during the day. And now we're going to take a second to look at trauma-sensitive schools. What do they do? You might have already been looking at those as I was explaining SEL, which is fine. And again, what are those tenets? And we're going to look at this here. We're going to go into the purple, but the idea here is first, let's tease it out. What are we talking about? Because it's also something that coming from the research is really great to both expose all staff or all school personnel or anyone who has interactions with young people to really get them to understand that we want them to be sensitive of what's happening in young people's lives. And what does that mean? It means that trauma affects all of us. That no one, at times we're all experiencing it differently. We might experience different traumas, obviously, but understand that it affects all of us. And we have to kind of just first say that out loud, own that, to say that it is okay. And that in a way, that is how we can start building empathy with each other first. Obviously, this comes from a more clinical approach, and that's okay. Again, our tier 3 and tier 2 interventions are meant to be focused, are meant to be provided or supported by, again, trained individuals. So we still go back to, a lot of our work at the times in this integration is also to know who your allies are in this work as you implement. And definitely as we talk about professional development or capacity building, is for teachers to know that they are not supposed to be the one-stop shop, or you are not supposed to be, is to know you're supposed to know all your assets within your school so that you can make the best informed decision about the support, especially applying that healing-centered mindset to apply to say, how can I make sure that I could be the ally that little Fausto needs in his life for whatever I hear is coming out of him, and connect him to, again, the appropriate and hopefully quality resource that can help him reintegrate either into the classroom or, again, to just get the support that he needs, depending on what is unpacked. Reduction of harmful practices, procedures, and policies. Again, we are all bound. One of the first things we talk a lot about with behavioral health teams is let's be clear about our existing policies and procedures of this space, because there's a lot of them that we already are trained in and should already click in. We need to, I guess, remind teachers, support staff about what those are, obviously aligning back to our systems of support to then when does something graduate from just general tier 1 to tier 2, or what incidences might come up that just graduate from a tier 1 support where we get information from Fausto about what's happening in his life through our general SEL activities, But then right away, we're like, oh no, we need to make sure that he gets some tier 3 support based off either, again, academic and or social emotional constructs that are happening or challenging in his life. So let's just, again, talk really quickly about the purple, because again, these are foundation and the shared attributes around SEL and trauma-sensitive schools: a focus on safety, focus on positive, I would say, relationships. I'll put positive there because not all relationships are made the same. A lot of great guidance here coming out of the Search Institute around developmental relationships to make sure that, again, we push ourselves to both, again, express care, share power, different ways of, again, expanding relationships. And I'll be the first one to say, depending on the topic and depending on the young person, the dynamic will always come that some of the SEL concepts will not just come out in that interaction. That's where we still go back to, at some point, we always have to find that caring adult, someone who that young person has a good relationship with, to help them explore safety. Because sometimes we might inadvertently try to unpack a conversation, a situation, if you might implement restorative practices that bubbles up, including a fight or something that along the line. And again, if the adult does not provide the proper safety to unpack what happened or what is happening, the young person will not, or at times will not, just easily disclose what is going on. So we have to just be cognizant of that again, of our relationship and how relationships matter. And we'll talk about that. But again, we also need to find who the young person might have a good relationship with, depending on the situation. We also want to empower young people to, again, that's where this competency, skill, the focusing on skill and competency development is empowering, because it is less behaviorist. It is less, if you do this, you're rewarded by this, versus empowering their psychologies to find their own solutions, to explore, to have inquiry in what's going on. But again, we'll always take very, again, responsiveness either to the culture, to the context of the young person, because again, the overall piece here is well-being, and that is a complicated construct, well-being, because well-being is going to mean different things to different actors or actresses, depending on what we are talking about. So as you see, it has to take an integrated approach to this work to get those purple things prioritized. But one of the big key levers that we're going to get back to here is also, again, staffing, is the readiness. And this goes back to where we all have a bit of both adult SELing to kind of do some kind of continuing education in the space. Because as we get into the integration or the research, it really talks about how we need to motivate our staffing to think about our willingness, the application, the relevance to this work. And at times that is getting and being very clear about the connections between SEL and the general academic outcomes that we're all shooting for. We have to be motivated as adults to explore our biases, our, at times, education, or how our education, depending on how we were trained as educators or our teaching certificates, have not exposed us to some of these concepts. And then understanding that we might need to change, and change is hard. So again, some of the social emotional companies, just even the self-aware teacher, puts us in a place of saying, just because I went through a certification process, just because I was a teacher of the year once, does not mean that I do not have more to learn. And one of the best things about this, again, emerging base of a systems building, is to say it all takes all of us. It takes not only all of our assets and skills, but it also takes all of our relationships. Because as I loaded, sometimes one of the biggest motivation is to make sure that staff gains those beliefs, the attitudes, change the mindsets where they see young people as partners in education versus as someone who is there, that they are just there to anoint with all of their amazing information or knowledge base. So staff beliefs towards the way that the interaction between, again, an adult and young people, at times the power dynamics are one of the biggest things that we need to attack in our mindset. But more than anything, it really is going to be about building the motivation of staff to get into those practices of doing either self-reflections on themselves around their skill competencies, using, again, different self-assessment tools that exist around that you also get as part of this session, but really pushing ourselves as our general capacity building exercises as we think about professional development, to really use that as a key motivator to and emphasizing the why integration is so important, so that we can pull out and support the general capacity of everyone to implement what we have decided to do, again, in this SEL trauma sensitive MTSS approach. We need everybody to understand what they do well, and what is their function within the system. We need everyone to understand their own knowledge, assess their own skill-specific understanding of SEL and trauma. And as I mentioned before, also know that they may not have all the answers, and that's okay, but they need to be aware of the system and all the other human or system-based supports, external, internal, that can support them. So sometimes knowledge and skills is both what you individually bring to the table about the intervention, obviously SEL trauma, but also who else do I have there that is, again, an expert in this. So it's about knowing what you know and knowing also what you don't know, and making sure that you don't, unfortunately, or by happenstance, cause harm by connecting things that didn't need to be there in the young people's lives, or based off of what they're experiencing. Now, mindsets, especially in the realm of self-awareness, self-management for us adults, puts us in a space, again, of actionable place to engage in how we think about our traditional perspectives towards education or young people in their work and the work that we do, towards, again, a trauma-sensitive SEL perspective to how we come to the work and support that we give to our young people. So we'll take a second to look at those traditional perspectives and juxtapose what you see on the right of the trauma-sensitive perspectives. This is going to be an opportunity for you to make sure that you can also think through what are the points that are hard or challenging to you or some of your colleagues, depending on your learning setting or the age group. Right away, when I see it, the judgmental is always a hard one, because we all have bad days. So we talk about taking judgment to curiosity. Again, quick shifts that can put us in a place of asking why versus leading with a potential judgment or some labels. Again, we talk about power. There's this idea of obedience versus, again, wanting to be in partnership or collaboration, build cooperation in the classroom through these mindsets. Again, this idea of traditional perspective going forward, even though we want focused, individualized supports, we want to broaden the scope of saying that it's Fausto. I think we've all seen that visual of a little kid walking into a school with a different backpack that's just jam-packed with different things that they're all experiencing. So it's individualized support, but understanding that the environmental constructs and factors are also what the young people are bringing into the classroom. And we want to change in the traditional, this idea of a fixed, this young person is a D student, can never come out of D, to understanding that we need to go to a strength-based, proactive of getting preventative in saying, oh, how do we make sure that we are so in tune with our young people? We have such great relationships that they gush and tell us things, and thus right away they do that because we are always trying to help them promote ways of growing and ways of doing better even, versus always chastising and or punishing where they don't feel comfortable and or safe to disclose anything that's happening in their life, with always fear of punishment or labeling. Again, relationships really chip away at how we get to getting young people more and more comfortable to do that with us. Let's unpack quickly some of these others. Again, always an opportunity to think about how this looks or things that you might be doing, again, in your system currently. And obviously, any of these traditional perspectives, how you want to challenge them, either with the new terminology or just in general conversations that will help you all as, again, professionals to build capacity in the space, right? And really challenge the way that we're bringing this into the classroom or the hallways. So again, punitive, we've all seen it. When we think about that, is really about saying that discipline and the policies, procedures that might already be inherited at times really need to be challenged to make sure that young people are learning from the error. So again, a restorative approach puts us in a place of really, again, putting young people in a competency-based space. What happened there? How can you do that better next time? And even if there is a punishment, depending on the degree of what happens, at least it becomes more talked through and at times even justified through the conversation or the restorative chat about what happened. Traditional perspectives, again, are siloed. We're talking about integration, the word is there, the systems building, the idea that, again, no, this is what's happening with me. It's not, I don't have any help, I don't have any other systems of support, challenges that traditional perspective where it takes everyone to do this. So we need to work smart, not hard here, by pushing an integrative mindset so that we aren't one siloed, but also making sure that we are very much hyper aware of the systems of support that we are now integrated into and how to both access them and make sure that our young people follow through with that. Now, this is a big one because we always want to make sure that we are in that contextualizing what is happening in the learning environments of our young people. It is critical to both, again, be humble in the approach, where we talked about before, this idea of leading with curiosity versus judgment, is to, again, as we think about what is happening in the young people's lives, coming with cultural humility to understand what is happening in their cultural values, beliefs that shape what is happening in their lives is important. And there is another one where us as adults have to challenge our dominant culture narrative, even if we find ourselves being from the same culture as a young person, is to make sure that, again, we are always individualizing and challenging one size fits all both approaches and supports, because everyone is going to need different things. And this is a great one. Again, academics are critical. Academics are important in the development of our young people, but so is their social, emotional, or psychosocial development, as it supports academic gains. It supports developing that interest, or what Dewey has always called that lifelong learner, because at times, even as in my own experience, could have easily lost me in 7th grade if it was only focused on academics versus everything that was challenging me in 7th grade towards my attention to academics. You have to think about it as ecologically. So the mindsets are important, and it puts us, again, as adults, as the implementer, into a place of making sure that we are constantly growing and pushing ourselves to grow at challenging these mindsets and putting us in a reflective space, using some of those self-reflection tools to really think about how we do this and challenging our own biases. Now, that also puts us in a place of needing to support adult SEL and well-being. So adults, as we have emerged in this SEL space, have had to do a lot of catch-up. All right, it's an issue of saying, like, oh, these competencies not only are important, look at all this amazing research, look at all these activities, look at all these ways of doing and implementing SEL. But more and more, it's really about getting foundational at what are these competencies, and how does my classroom, how does my content area, how does my general work, how does my intentional work inside of in the hallways support the competency development or the role modeling to the young people who are constantly watching for cues on the application of these skills, We're also then really critical around these mindsets, because we know that that's going to take how we develop or get into these relationships with young people around that teaching, the modeling, the coaching, the formative approach to, again, both exposing and pushing them to crystallize and master these skills. But again, we have to have those mindsets that intrinsically promote that young people have the capacity to do this, and that we are key levers in that journey. But again, we have to pay attention to our own well-being, our own emotional states as we engage these young people in both just general education and obviously trauma-sensitive education in our schools. So again, this lives mostly in, again, what we have to push ourselves as why it's so important, because we've seen in the research that, again, when educators pay attention to their own SEL competencies, they have a stronger influence on the learning conditions of the student. They're able to motivate them. And I would even say just good SEL educators are such, in a way, great role models that their students tend to see the application of the skills or the competencies in play. And depending on the content or topics, we address what is happening in those situations to think through the application of social awareness, of the decision-making skills that would happen there or need to happen differently to address those situations. And they mostly think about this as, again, not a curriculum of SEL versus, again, this SEL is just part of the learning environment. Now, we know that stress affects young people. Well, again, both this year of trauma and stress has really affected everyone, right? The virtual environment, the hybrid learning, the what happens next mentality has not done well for anyone's mental health. And we need to make sure that we pay attention to that, especially for those already bought in SEL, trauma-sensitive educators, because we need them to stick around. We need them to be the next coaches to those incoming teachers or those teachers who have not necessarily bought in, so that we do not necessarily have just kind of that turnover that impacts our schools, but more than anything, that turnover impacts students, because we've talked about how relationships are so critical. So the more that we can get educators on the hook for understanding that, one, they need to think about this as implementers, but also take care of themselves so that they can stick around, because this SEL stuff really is critical in the psychology of young people, and psychology thrives with consistency. At time, that turnover in the relationships has definite impact on both the students' just general perceptions of school, and obviously those outcomes are wanting to come to school. That is not, again, it's something that just can happen in the livelihood of what's depending on the teacher or the school. If we can model these SEL skills or competencies and really put it outside of just another activity, is this idea that, again, then becomes it's more and more in an applied space, and modeling that and seeing the opportunity to really know, oh, that is a good decision, or even talking through that with an educator or an adult is nothing but helpful, especially based off of like the grayness of some of the skill competencies in application. It takes a lot of conversation, and so the educator really needs to both know it at a crystallized level, but also know how to, again, model these and put them in play, and at times be explicit about what they're talking about in the SEL space and how it supports academics or how it supports their overall well-being. Now, this is an interesting one because, again, we want back to the mindset. We need teachers, implementers, practitioners to think about this almost as that this is part of the mindset of teaching. This is just good learning, because though we did find that those who are mandated to teach SEL at times, probably based off of the attitude of anything that kind of tends to be mandated or told to you to do, at times probably does not come off authentic. But however, teachers who enhance their own, are committed, their mindset is they're bought in and keep pushing their own well-being, have better impact on these SEL spaces and supports for young people. So again, the mindset is critical, the buy-in, the motivation, and sustaining it, and making sure that this SEL and trauma sensitivity is not a soft topic versus an ongoing conversation in how we implement our systems of support. Okay, so what does it take to do the work? Again, it takes a joint implementation process. It's all hands on deck. It takes teaming, it takes specialized teams, depending on what the data and experiences in the trauma space is and what your young people are either telling you or what you find out along the way, is that we're gonna need teams to make sure that we're focused on the support. It's going to be really helpful to think about these teams as even tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 systems of support, and the different teams that either help coordinate those systems or, again, just make sure that those tiers, again, are adequate and continue to bring in the appropriate and, again, even quality resources. That teaming and general integration is going to need, again, joint and ongoing professional development from, again, maybe not necessarily just content-based or, again, math, science-based, topical versus, again, integration and how to bring in more mental health, even potentially more just general community service providers who might even be in this space already about comprehensive student support or SEL, and combining professional development. So again, consistency. So we're right on the messaging so that we are not inadvertently confusing young people or creating dissonance as they're giving different messages in these spaces. And this is, again, where data comes in, is monitoring and evaluation, is that we have to challenge ourselves to the type of data that we're looking and reviewing and bringing into data discussions. Challenge ourselves to potentially gather more data or more insights at the individual or student level or specific to, again, trauma sensitivity. Or as now we know that these are the Castle 5 or the skill or competencies that we're shooting for, more ongoing data collection around how young people are experiencing self-awareness in their classroom or ability to apply responsible decision-making so that we get key insights from monitoring evaluation of how practice in the classroom or in the hallways needs to change to better support young people. Now in this, again, is always about how we get better. And so again, here, these are some reflective questions for you to think through about how trauma, you and your staff can think about how all of these topics from today's session, and obviously the integration of SEL and trauma, are affecting you. And then also getting to a place of how your students are being affected. Again, we want to create the various different perspectives, both at the individual level, but also how might that be either similar or different to, again, the young people that you're working with. I see you, Jamila. Discussion?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Fausto. That was really great. You provided such important information on SEL and trauma and integrating those two. I think it's really helpful. So I really appreciate you taking some time to talk through this with the schools and the districts today.
Thank you so much for having me.